on building in public for day 2.
Day 2.
So we we sort of, in a brash decision, decided to rename lunch break to building in public. So here we are, and we in our haste to start building in public, we didn't actually secure any guests yet.
In our haste to start.
So here we are, building.
Well, we're building.
We're building our building in public, and you can see the garage is up.
Yeah.
And there's nothing fakery. There's no, man behind the curtain. This is just us building in public.
This is how it is. Yeah.
But we do have, we are collecting an Airtable, and we do have some people gathering up on the Airtable, where we're going to be hosting people soon. I think we actually also may have a guest, if I'm looking right. I think we have a guest set up for tomorrow, once we get over the account issues.
Yeah.
Yeah. So overall, I think it's off to a good start, but we sort of need to secure our guests ahead of time. We got very excited, which is good.
That's okay. I mean, we can build in public right now and talk about building in public, or we could even do our Twitter thing, like whatever you think.
Yeah, well, I think I shared the Replit announcement that is interesting. So I
thought it was really cool that it's run by this 20-year-old guy who built $1,000 MRR startup on Replit, it says. But that's pretty cool that I know that he's been like so vocal about empowering younger people, and it's cool to see him actually doing that.
Yeah. So some notable features of this thing. So Replit Ventures, new kind of startup incubator. And so it's 100% remote and global. So that's pretty different. 100% Bitcoin funding pool. So that's different. Full service, tools, infra, and distribution. So I wonder how that works. Like, I can imagine the tools are Replit, infra Replit, I guess. And then distribution, is it like, do they somehow feature these projects in the, is there a discovery surface on Replit that people currently go to, or they're going to kind of have, I guess, follow-on discussion of what's happening in the Replit Ventures world?
Yeah, not sure.
And open to all backgrounds, including teens. Yeah, which is cool. You mentioned how they're sort of empowering the next generation and kind of getting people excited from the first moment, where they might be able to start dabbling in programming and stuff. I mean, some people accomplished quite a bit in their teens too. So
yeah.
So I'm going to read this blog post that was actually linked to get a little bit deeper on this.
Oh, cool.
So it's a $2,000 grant. Weekly workshops with guest speakers, exclusive community of founders. So it feels to me like it's a pretty like structured thing. It's not, I wasn't sure if it was kind of like, here's a grant and go flourish and do interesting things, but it looks like it has a little bit more structure to it. It starts April 26th and it goes for 4 weeks. And then did you know of this Soren who's organizing it?
I don't really know anything about him, but looks like he built something on Replit, and I think he was an intern.
So he built a $1,000 MRR startup on Replit in 3 weeks. So 20-year-old computer science student based in Seattle. He's been interested in the intersection of finance and computer science. He worked as a software engineer at a fintech and worked on this tool called Blubber. And they wanted to make a trading bot. So the premise was that if you bought within minutes of the form coming out, the SEC form, that you could make money on that. If you, I guess, you buy a SPAC as soon as the SPAC paperwork hits the SEC website in its public forum, and then they would, I guess, execute some trades and buy some of the SPAC, buy some stock in the SPAC.
Is that his thing that he built?
I think that's what Blubber is, the thing that Soren had built.
Oh,
that I think got to
where is
$1,000.
the link to that?
Oh,
blubber.io.
Yeah, here's blog.replit.com/BLUBDR. I linked.
Oh, cool.
He's got like a screenshot of his Blubber app text bot thing.
Oh, okay.
Cutting the fat off the whales. With a few Reddit posts and TikToks, grew to nearly 4,000 members.
Oh, wow. TikToks. I wonder what they put on TikTok.
Right.
Does it link that?
It doesn't say. It just mentions TikTok, so it doesn't link to the specifics. And so it sounds like they have one BTC, roughly 60,000 USD, to invest into accepted startups. So it's kind of like this is sort of like the first batch or cohort, or kind of the prototype version of this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, that all kind of makes sense and is cool. I mean, we talk a lot about sort of the evolving, kind of startup and financing and venture ecosystem. And, I'm trying to think, are there good examples where these things have come out of companies? Because that feels a little fresher to me. Certainly companies have venture arms.
Have like venture arms, like
right. That's in a sense like a big capital pool, and then they hire people to be GPs, and it feels a little more traditional in a sense, like a little less operational. I mean, this has echoes of something like what Daniel Gross is doing with Pioneer. So it has like some small scale grant style, like probably relatively low stakes, low commitment, creative projects. But certainly like a different set of assets.
Venture arm or fund or whatever, because Substack has writer support, like a couple other people have done grants of similar amounts, and I guess like positioning them different ways, or I don't know how the details of the agreement work and or between these things.
Speaking of building in public, we actually have pushing live software to public, which was just done on the Highlighter platform in the last 24 hours, I think. Did that push go? I think it did.
Yeah.
So what I was going to do is try out our first ever screen share. Let me share. All right, can you see my Twitter?
Yes, I can.
All right. I'm trying to size it so that it gets
Yeah, it looks good.
big. Now we can actually read Twitter while we're reading Twitter. You can just tell me to pause if something if you want to click on something.
Let's see what ads Twitter thinks it should do.
How does this, by the way, does this little choppy?
The little video? It's not that bad.
Not too bad. Talking about something in particular? How does my Twitter feed look to you? Is it like surprising or weird compared to what you might expect? This is one I actually want to get Jack Mahler's on Strike. I think we talked about Strike, right?
I can't remember what it is.
So Strike is a cross-border kind of money transfer.
Oh, yes. We talked about that. We
wrote uses Bitcoin
blog that you were announcing it. Yeah.
Oh, I noticed Nadia showed up here, so we should invite her.
Oh, Nadia.
While we're waiting for Nadia, I'll show you. Oh, here's Nadia. Nadia!
Hey, how's it going?
Good, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good. I'm
Welcome.
taking a literal lunch break, so don't mind me like noshing on the side.
Please do. But do you notice the new title?
No. What's happening?
We rebranded Lunch Break.
Ooh.
It's now called Building in Public.
Oh, I love it. I did notice it. I thought it was the theme for today, and I was excited to hear what you guys were discussing.
Yeah, we decided, I think through conversations like we had with you before and other friends, we found that there's actually just like a lot of energy around, you're thinking about like, what are you going to build next? And we're talking to other people who are currently building things. It just feels like there's so much energy around this stuff. And that's who we like to spend our time with. That's the kind of stuff we like to talk about. So we're like, lunch break, serves some sort of descriptive purpose, but building in public is a little bit more descriptive of like what we actually like to do here.
That's cool.
So we kind of rebranded it, and then we didn't actually secure a bunch of guests who are building in public. So we're just building in public.
Oh, it's awesome. I love it.
Yeah.
So we're happy to see you show up because you're building, and you can be, however much you want to do in public, we're here for it.
Oh, thanks.
Mm-hmm. What's happening? What's on your mind lately?
So it's been an interesting couple of weeks. So it's been like my first sort of attempt at doing like a design sprint by myself. And I think that's actually been really good in that it's like starting to move into the ideation stage after exploring problem spaces for a while and trying to sort of be in the white space. Mm-hmm. And I think I go back and forth between being really excited and knowing that it's like good and realizing how much slower it is doing it by yourself.
Right.
So I am actually procrastinating with my lunch break building in public because I am prototyping today and tomorrow, and hopefully we'll test with some customer interviews this week.
Oh, cool. Wow. Like for an idea, or was this more like personal reflection type stuff?
It is, but I would say like at this stage, part of it is just like getting into the process, I think, more so than like I go back and forth because I'm like, I'm not really deeply excited about the idea this week, but I'm excited to like, I know that by prototyping it and like giving it to people, I'm going to learn a bunch. But I'm trying not to be too precious because I think it's like it's not the idea, but it's like good to be doing this process, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep. And do you feel like you through the process you'll probably like discover a bunch of stuff, but do you feel like the general space where this lives is something that you are passionate about, but just the particular kind of starting point isn't? Is that?
Yeah, exactly. So I've had sort of these two spaces that I've been interested in. One is around like sort of empowering women, like professional women. And then the other is sort of reducing like sadness, depression. And so the first sprint, I just chose one and I'm sort of focused on the like empowering women theme. And so that's where I started. And I think I am really excited about the space. I don't know if this is like the one that I'm going to go for, but it feels like a new way to approach it versus like, I think I'd been doing a lot of research. I've been talking to a lot of people, and I think it's good now to start to turn on some of the like ideation gears.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything you can share about sort of what's top of mind there? Or?
Yeah. So I guess like I can share sort of what I storyboarded it yesterday. So it's like starting to get less fuzzy, but basically the like, it's kind of, I think, convoluted, but the idea this week is basically around like, I think there's something interesting around like, how do you sort of connect people with like different resources? And there are sort of three main like themes that stood up, like wanting to like earn more and like having tools to help with that, wanting to like learn and like grow and sort of like have resources to help with that. And then just like wanting to like connect with others and like have sort of community and a means to like getting to know people sort of socially. And so in sort of my like, you do like a lightning demo phase where you sort of look at lots of different things. And I think one thing I really liked was like, how do you sort of create like really lightweight paths to get folks to sort of that like aha moment for what they need? And so that's sort of how I've been thinking about it is like, there was this quiz for this thing called an Enneagram that I took for like a run related session. And it sort of was like, you know, do you identify more with A or B? And it's like very, very fast and lightweight. And I think the idea is like, how do you sort of connect people, whether it's like, you know, content, whether it's like educational resources, or whether it's like community and other people. And so that's sort of how I've been thinking about it. I think even as I'm talking about it, I'm like, this is like massively convoluted. And I think that's okay for a first attempt, but that's sort of where my brain is at so far.
And how does that, like, I think there's a lot in there. So if you had to sort of distill it to like a single phrase to like, you know, you run into somebody on the street and they're like, oh, cool, you're working on a new thing. What is it? And like the light is about to turn and they have to leave. Like what's sort of the
elevator pitch? I think it's like basically what's like, how do you create like a hub for like the resources and connections you need as like a mid-career ambitious woman professional to advance and grow, or, you know, earn more, or sort of achieve the thing that you are hoping to achieve in the next phase.
So is that kind of in the, oh, sorry, go ahead, Mishti.
Oh, I was going to ask like what sorts of things you think would be the best candidate resources, or like for yourself, what has been the most helpful kind of stuff?
It's a good question. I think it really depends on like what is the person trying to achieve and like how do they learn. And so I think that's part of the challenge. Like I think my instinct is like originally maybe it can be more like curation oriented of like how do you sort of connect people to all the things that are out there. and like find the best one. Because I think one thing that I was surprised by in my own research is like there are so many things out there that I just didn't know existed that could have been really helpful to me. And I think it's probably
what kind of stuff is that? Is it more like written up like posts and things, or more community oriented?
A bit of both, to be honest. Like I think the sort of range was like there are communities, there's like sort of like crowd generated, like user generated content, there's like curated content sort of from experts or folks that have sort of interviewed experts, and then there's like classes, tutorial, sort of book, like education type things. And so I think there's probably a couple of different like social dynamics that I'm not going to do at this sprint, but like I want to think more deeply about, because I think there's like the sort of like one-to-many, like I can join a class and learn. There's like the I can sort of like self-help, like get, the book or the article or the resource and do it myself. And then I think there's something potentially around like interactions. And I feel like that one is maybe there's a couple, like maybe there's sort of like the expert interaction. There's probably also like the community, like sort of peer interaction. And so I don't know. I think a lot of these exist in pockets, but my thinking is like, how do you put it together in a way that's, I guess, more useful or filling that gap that like I felt I was missing. And that's sort of where I've started. I have no idea if this is going to go anywhere, but I was like, all right, I'm going to start by solving something that like is fun and interesting, and like we'll try it, and then I'm probably going to fail a bunch and learn a bunch, and we'll go from there.
And do you think this embodies, I'm trying to make sure I understand, because it's kind of, there's a bunch of resources that you have in mind that need to be pulled together. There's a bunch of people that might be relevant to. Do you see this as like something of, I'm trying to imagine, is it a website where you aggregate those resources? Is it like a Slack group where you gather those people and then share resources through that? Or is there some new model that you have in mind?
No, I'm not sure. And I feel like that's where the fuzziness comes in. Like I was thinking basically of like for the prototype, making like an app or website prototype and just having it be sort of as simple as I can for something that's so complicated. But I think it's a really good question of like, how would this actually manifest? I think it's probably not a Slack group, but I think part of the problem today is that there isn't necessarily like a good, like the flow. I was trying to think of like, what is the flow of like, how do I search these things? And I think it's like, I Google it or someone tells me, then I sort of go down this rabbit hole. So I don't know what the right platform is, but for this week, it's probably going to be something simple.
Can I ask a question? Why isn't it a Substack?
What was the question? Sorry, I just took a big bite.
Why isn't it a Substack? Is Substack not the right format? Yeah.
I think it's not. But I think it's a good push. Like, I think part of it for me is just like, I personally am a little bit overwhelmed with like all the Substacks. And so I feel like maybe early on it was something where it was starting to give more signal than noise, but it's gotten to the point where like there's so many Substacks. Each of the Substack is like their own lens on curation. And it just has become like massively noisy for me. So it could be, but I think it hasn't been helpful for me personally as the sort of the channel.
I'm just wondering, like, if you aggregate a bunch of resources, it seems like every time you do the aggregation, you kind of want to push to people who have expressed interest, and that could be Twitter, could be, could be your own email list that you manage via MailChimp, could be Substack. But in the case of Substack, those things then kind of live on as blog posts. So any work you do into curation, you both get to push to people, but then also you have like a historical record of, and it's easy for people to share an email around. Like if they're like, oh, I got a lot of value out of that, let me send it to my other friend who gets a lot of value. Whereas something that's more blog oriented that doesn't connect to like a distribution channel, I think it's a little bit tougher to, in a sense, kind of find its place in the world.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, because it's like, I guess part of the question is like, is the challenge like content discovery, or is it like the platforms that exist? And like, which of those is like a bigger pain point, or is it both? And like, or like the combination somehow is like not quite there. Because I think, like, to your point, if the platforms are great, but it's like the content discovery is the challenge, then maybe it's like more curation or something is enough. But if the platform is the issue, I think that's maybe where it gets like more interesting in terms of like, how would you actually like reinvent this if that is helpful?
Is your hypothesis that there's likely a missing kind of curation platform. If I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like curation is a theme that you're touching on a lot.
I think so. I think there's something about like, I don't know if it's like curation or like accessibility, but it's like the combination of like being able to like find the thing that maybe I didn't know I needed, but like is the thing that is going to be most helpful. And I think there's a lot of platforms that are like disparate that like kind of do parts of it. Like you can sort of get help from Facebook groups. You can sort of get information from Substacks or Twitter, you know, interactions on Zooms, like webinars. So I don't know. I haven't gone super deep there, but I think that's sort of what I'm curious about is like, if you sort of bring these together, is that something that's going to create value, or is it just like yet another thing that now people have to monitor and then it's actually not that useful?
Right.
Yeah.
I have kind of a working hypothesis that I'll float with you, and you can say like, I believe this or I don't believe this. But I almost feel like almost any new kind of platform, whether it's a curation platform or a publishing platform or communication, you should almost be able to like prototype the idea with an existing platform, because people's behaviors don't shift so dramatically. It's almost like the behaviors that grow up on one platform, that platform tends to underserve in certain ways. But by using that one, you can use an existing platform that underserves to like build audience, exercise your own product muscles around what is working for you and what's not. And so I wonder, is there, and I'm not trying to push Substack too hard. It's just, comes to mind to me to be one that has some relevance to kind of curation and publishing and distribution. But like, for example, I think, where we are right now with Highlighter, I think we would not have known that we had all the pain to cause us to design this product if we hadn't first run them on Zoom. And like, there were tons and tons of Zooms happening. So Zoom itself wasn't very unique, but I think without the pain of like, how do we compose the stage and how do we publish it out to YouTube and how do we have our own copies and how do we make highlights? All of those things kind of emerged from the pain we experienced using another platform that was like good enough, but ultimately didn't really serve our needs. So I wonder if there's like an analogy there.
No, I think there could be. And it's interesting, like I haven't yet fully thought through like what am I going to test in these interviews, but it could be an interesting like side by side of like if I prototype like a website or an app and I want to side by side it with like a Substack mock-up, like what would that look like? How would people react? Because I think one way in the past that I've learned a ton from these sort of design sprints is like you take what you think the solution is and like put it side by side to like what is already out there. Like I remember with Camcord used to do this. We had sort of like, this was like before Snap Maps was like a thing and then wasn't a thing, but we were really into like location-based social, strong phase. But I forget what the name of the company was, but there was a company out there, I think in Europe, that like had this. And so we would run.
Is this Zenly?
I think it was. Yeah, it was Zenly. Yeah. So we would put it like side by side. And we learned a lot actually from like what are the pain points or concerns people have that haven't necessarily used Zenly but are seeing it, and what are the parts that are sort of delightful.
Mm-hmm. I think there's certainly the kind of comparison differences, and I think there's certainly value to that, so I don't mean to discount that, but I think I'm saying something slightly different, so I just want to make sure that I
want to make sure I get it.
I think that if there's a new platform to be built, then you should be able to get enough, this is my hypothesis, is you should be able to get enough signal using a broken platform that you then grow into the new thing because the first one works well enough, but is also fundamentally broken.
That makes sense.
It's kind of like, I don't know which platform would be closest to what you're talking about, but it's more like, can you actually build audience, actually create content in some format? And we saw this with like Nathan Vashez has been, on here. He was actually an early employee at Substack and then left and did a bunch of kind of tools. And now he writes a relatively well-known Substack called Every, which is kind of an aggregation. And he just like sees so many more problems with how he wants to publish, given that he has built on Substack. And now he's actually in the content creation process. He's like, oh, actually, now I understand the products I want to build to serve this thing that we have that doesn't really work on Substack. So that pattern of like, use the existing tools, being aware that they may and likely could break in certain ways, but that gives you the oxygen in a sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for clarifying that. I feel like that's actually a really interesting point. I'm trying to think what would be the existing thing for this, because I feel like there are a lot, but they haven't resonated. So I don't know, like, what is the one that is like the most good at this so far?
Yeah, kind of depends on what it's for, I guess. Because when I was looking for a job, I know I was on a bunch of job-related Substacks that were really helpful, actually. And then more for postings, though. And then something like Renko or like a community-based messaging platform. I looked at Alpha for like a bit, but never really got into it for some reason. I don't know if you've explored much or what you think about something like that.
It's funny, like very similar to what you said. Like the name keeps coming up, but I haven't heard of anyone actually, like, and it could just be I'm not talking to the right people, but I haven't heard of folks who have used it and like found a lot of value.
Yeah.
Sort of is like the name that comes up.
And I wonder where that is. Yeah, like that's like the classic name that comes up exactly, but like what's missing there?
In the structure of Alpha is, if I understand it, it's a little bit like a subreddit almost. Is that kind of, it's like link sharing and discussions around links? Is that kind of the core of how that works?
Looks like it. I'm just scrolling right now.
So, and it's interesting, like a lot of the like other sort of, none of them I would say like have been brought up as much as Alpha, but like things in the space, you either have sort of like you're a subscriber to a sort of like community and there's a mix of like discussion plus events plus like curated content, or it's more like discussion boardy, sort of similar to Reddit. Like Alpha, I think, is sort of there. You have groups on Facebook like Women in Product or Tech Ladies that are sort of more like group discussion-y. And those are sort of the ones that I found, I guess, that are like the main platforms.
So and yeah,
Discords and Slack too.
I'm curious what you know why this name comes up but doesn't, but I guess maybe doesn't fulfill the need that, or like what are the needs that it does fulfill or may fulfill, and what does it maybe miss, and what is it that you want to serve that? Because in a sense, you know, we can look at this and say like, here's some free prototyping in the world. It's like somebody's doing R&D on this problem and it's somehow not hitting the mark that you have in mind. So, you know, is it the set of people around the table there? Is it the filtering criteria? Is it the tooling? You know, what sort of, what might work, or what sort of unexplored that you're excited about?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I don't even feel like I know enough about Alpha to know why it is. Like, the sense that I get is like there's this disconnect where it feels like there is sort of this like pain point and like want for like, you know, community plus like resources for sort of women professionals. But then of places like Alpha that exist, I haven't had an easy time finding folks who actually like use it and have found value. Like the most common sort of answer I've gotten is like, oh, like I know of this, I've like looked at it, but I like never really got into it. And so I don't know where sort of that drop off is, because it just feels like I haven't even found people that are like, oh yeah, like I'm active on this and like this is the pain point that, you know, is annoying or could be better. It's like they're not even active.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe it's just not focused enough. Like I'm going to it and I'm just kind of like, wow, this is a lot of random stuff that's not really relevant to me. Like the first three things say hiring a senior Ruby on Rails engineer, seeking partner for VC firm, and like looking for beta testers for some app. And I'm kind of like, I don't know or care about any of those things. Then if I go on top, it's more like AMA-y, like some founders of 3 companies kind of having AMAs. But I wonder, maybe there's good content there, but it's just not, like I would rather come to this and it be like negotiation, like finding a job and like finding mentorship, or like whatever the main pain points are, and then you can pick one of those and like just get a really curated set of articles or content, and then maybe a couple people you can talk to, like just not too overwhelming.
Right. I like that idea. Mishti, one of the things that it really suggests is like kind of almost like a too extreme focus. You might call it like too extreme, and I mean that like in a good way. but like, like negotiation, it's a topic that comes up again and again. There's a lot of people in Renco who are always asking for advice and tips on it. And I've been on a bunch of phone calls with people trying to help out just as a, sideshow helper to Renco. And I think it's something that there's just, we've talked before, there's just like a lot of appetite around that. And I think there's a lot of imbalance that could empower people. So it feels like that's the kind of thing you could actually say, go deep on some niche like that, I think when people hear women professional, maybe they're like, okay, like I've heard of Alpha, I've heard of things. I don't know. Maybe we don't all use them, but we know that they exist. Whereas if you say this is like the negotiation workshop or the negotiation newsletter or the negotiation podcast or something where you're like at the hub of this really narrow but important information.
Or even, I guess like the most extreme is picking one thing, but even if you wanted to pick like 3 things, I feel like those are 3 things that do come up a lot. Or you could pick whatever areas you're seeing come up a lot, but also just from within Renco, like another thing, like I think of the mentorship blog post that Renco wrote and put together and how that's also a big struggle. But instead of like building a platform where I could necessarily go to find mentors, because I think that can be really hit or miss. Like it's really hard to get that right and actually pair people in the right ways and whatever. Like maybe that's best left to the person doing it themselves, but resources like that blog or like how you should go about thinking about forming productive relationships when you're looking for a job. I feel like there's a lack of content there that would help people. Like these areas all seem very underexplored in terms of just even the content and curation.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, I feel like there's something in the like discovery, and I think it's an interesting question too of like, is there, the content is good and it's out there and there's like a gap in like how people are connecting to it, or is it like there's also a gap in content? It could be both. But I think my theory is initially like there's something there on like, how do you create easier paths to discovering, whether it's like content and resources or like people, but like how do you start to break down some of those challenges? And I think there are some interesting examples in niches. Like I think for jobs, at least in tech, like Candor seems really, really interesting in terms of how I think they've approached it, where I haven't actually like used them as a job seeker, but I remember when there sort of were a lot of layoffs at the beginning of last year, it sort of blew up, it seemed like. And it felt like something where they took sort of that niche approach very successfully and had sort of, I think, salary data was part of the wedge, but also like content to help with like specifically interviewing in roles at these sort of high growth tech companies. And I thought that was sort of a really good like niche play. And it sort of let them chip away at something that like it would have been easy to like not start and be like, oh, like LinkedIn has a locked on this or whoever. Right. But they took a really good approach there.
Yeah, that looks cool. I didn't know that really existed.
Yeah, I feel like it's pretty new, but it sort of blew up in the last year, I think.
So another pattern, I touched on this, but I think another pattern I've seen has worked well for people is to commit to like a space like this and to kind of, create, like I'm thinking again of like Jason Jacobs. He just like started a podcast because he just wanted to like meet all the people in the space. And he wasn't even really sure, like, am I going to start a company in this space? Am I going to start a community? Am I going to start a venture fund? He was just like, I just want to learn about it. And so it kind of became a platform and calling card to meet more people. And then by having that platform and calling card, more people are attracted to that. So, it's a struggle the first 5 or 10, and then it just kind of goes on its own. And now he's like running in every direction. He's like, I don't know, like I have this venture fund, I have this Slack community, I have these investments, and, it's sort of like he also sees product problems that he could solve because there's all this stuff flowing through. So I think that pattern seems to emerge again. So I wonder if like, would a podcast style creative kind of content and people thing, would that be attractive to you? I just think like your style works well there. Do you think, is that would that be like an exciting path to explore?
It's a good question. Like, I think I'm not sure. Like, I found it's funny, like a lot of my sort of casual, like chats with friends and like friends of friends and like experts in the spaces, I think were really productive. But then I felt like part of why I wanted to sort of focus in and like do this design sprint is some of them felt like they were starting to go in more of a like almost like producer-y direction of like, okay, like, you know, would it be helpful to facilitate more chats or bigger chats or like podcasting? Podcasting didn't come up, but like those sorts of things. And I felt like counterintuitively, I think I found myself like getting a little bit of diminishing returns on the learning. Like I think it created value for people that were listening, but I wanted to sort of like step back. And I think it's probably going to be like a back and forth, where I think it's going to be like step back, like ideate, and like lean back in, like expose myself to new people and ideas, like figure out if there's a connection, like go back again. But I felt like for me, sometimes I get caught up in the like creation and like, is this creating value for others, that I'm not able like in parallel to be like, okay, how will I apply this to the thing that I, you know, want to be ultimately building? And so I felt like it was starting to become a little bit of a distraction when early on it was really helpful as a way to explore.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. I think some sort of shingle or brand you can hang wherever it is.
Yeah.
I think it becomes kind of like a weather vane or a honeypot that you can reference, and, you know, it gives people some context to connect with you and this idea.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. So I had some thoughts on this yesterday, and I would love actually both of your thoughts. So one thing I was thinking, and I talked a little bit with Mitra, who's one of my sort of mentors in the fellowship, about this, was if maybe there's a way to sort of bring some of those conversations and follow-ups that have been more exploratory so far to sort of apply it in this more focused way. And so one thing that I'm probably not going to do the first couple sprints, but I've thought about is maybe figuring out if there's a way to bring people into this sprint process at particular stages. Because there's like an expert interview stage, there's sort of like an ideation, like brainstorming stage. And I think for some of these this first time, like I'm just doing it by myself, which is cool. But then you're like, cool, if I want to evaluate 5 ideas, I got to come up with 5 ideas. Right. Like it's exhausting. And so I wonder if there's a way to sort of like thoughtfully, you know, give folks the context and download it, but then have them contribute in a more like focused way as part of these sprints. But I go back and forth because I'm like, if they're not fully in it with me, like, is that going to be sort of annoying, or will it be, you know, productive and hopefully bring that same like exploratory energy, but in a more like applied sort of like useful immediately way? So I'm curious what your thoughts are, because this is something I've thought about, but I haven't tried yet.
So if you go ahead, Mishti, if you have thoughts.
Well, no, I was just going to ask, so basically instead of having these like diffuse brainstorming conversations with people, having like more focused, it's almost like super focused brainstorming sessions, which might have more of an agenda or like rails built around them, and might not just be like one every couple of weeks or months, but like 3 in a week, and you're going really deep on
exactly. Like I could do for, you know, I didn't do it, but I could have been like, this week I'm exploring, you know, empowering mid-career professional women. Here are like the 5 key insights. Like Mishti and DK, instead of jamming, we're going to do like a focused like sketch workshop together, and I'm going to give you the prompts and the context, and then we'll sort of individually sketch and ideate, and then we'll talk about it and like have sort of more of that like focus.
Yeah, I like that actually. I think it just makes for a really fresh ask also, especially if there are people that you don't know super, super well. But it's like, this is why you're relevant to this space. I have these questions I'm dying to ask, and like, what do you think about doing this like really focused, what do we call them, like thought labs? Sometimes it's more like the newsletter writers in the past, but it's kind of a similar idea.
I mean, I wonder, would, you know, a major theme that we're exploring is building in public. I wonder if any of these processes feel like they would be too scary or too confidential to do in public, or would they be okay?
That's actually like a good question, and I'm not sure because I think my like general style is very collaborative, but I also think I would want to be careful where I don't want people to feel like, okay, you know, like I'm like, I mean, it's so new to it that I don't even know, but it's like, would they feel like, oh, like I'm like advising you, and therefore, like, you know, I don't know. I don't know how it would feel. Like, would people feel comfortable with that kind of structure and jamming, or does it feel like, hey, like, you know, I don't work at your startup. Like, why are you asking me to
With
ideate?
a sense of like ownership over their ideas and stuff.
Right.
I feel like if you positioned it as not like, let's find an idea for my startup that I'm going to go build, but more like, this is a space that's fascinating and has a lot of problems, and like I'm interested in the space, leaving that open-ended. Let's go deep into it and see what could be a value add. Then people who care about the space like care about those issues too, like other people who care about empowering women or whatever. Because with the like when Lenny did his one with us, it wasn't really like, it was positioned more like, we really think growth is interesting and how a company scales from like 10 to 10,000 and that whole process, and like where are the gaps in content that like I can then go deep on and write, and that's helpful for everyone because it's not like everyone has the time or energy or like talent to necessarily do that, but they all want it to happen.
Yeah, I like that framing a lot because I feel like that's sort of it's a much clearer articulation of, I feel like in my head I've been like, well, I hope that by solving this or spending time on this, like it's something that will like generally be helpful for people. And I think there's like a lot of enthusiasm around like how to do that, but not necessarily people having the time or knowing, you know, like what can I do? It's a lot of like individual efforts. So maybe there's something there in terms of like, how do you apply this sort of focused ideation, you know, think storming in a way that feels like, okay, this is like, yes, it's helpful for me, but it's also like going to be more widely helpful as people think about, you know, how do we make progress on these like social issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's enough people who have energy for the kind of mission of what you're doing that I would, you know, I think you might be you're being like maybe almost too cautious, you know, relative to like people want to help. I think if you like, you know, stick a stake in the ground or you know, ask for it or mention what you're interested in, I think people will come to you and want to help, and they won't feel like, oh, Nadia's making me work on her startup.
Yeah.
I think it's, you know, people want to help. It's just, you know, if you work on something that they're excited about, then it should be kind of like easy in a sense, right? And I think if it's not easy, that I think that's a signal too. You're like, wow, I'm like banging my head against this wall and nobody's excited about this thing.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, no, I think you're right. It probably is more, at least right now, I think people are really excited about the spaces. They want to help. And I think so far it's been a lot of like exploratory convos, which I think were useful. But now I'm starting to feel like, okay, this is like, I'm hopefully going to enter this like slightly more focused period, and maybe I'll go back to exploration depending on how it goes. But I think I haven't figured out how to like channel that like desire to be helpful into something that at this stage is helpful yet, which is where some of the ideas around like think sort of things are coming from. Because I think instead it's been almost like what you were describing earlier, DK, where it's like, I think because people are excited, then they're thinking about the space and they're like, oh, like, do you want to help me with this idea that I came up with? And I'm like, I do, but also like now you start to like go broad. And I actually think that like there's sort of this like drive right now for me to go deep rather than go broad and like have lots of things cooking. I'm like, I want to start to ideate and like have a thing that I test and you know, it's not going to be the thing, but we'll start there.
Right? Yeah, it feels like it's a deeper and more useful kind of UX interview process, except because like in a sense, like everyone you're probably talking to has some experience, even if they're not a woman, like they're in the right space or they have something relevant. It's not like you're talking about like empowering small builders in like the middle of America where it's, it would just feel different. But since pretty much anyone you talk to in the tech space is relevant as a user, and then also like on the other side of the table, it's kind of nice to use these things as just like deep research for yourself and like brainstorming about the space. And I think they would all see it that way and not be like put off by like not feel used or anything. I wouldn't worry about that.
That's super helpful.
Yeah. Also, if, I don't know if it would be helpful or comfortable, but, if it's exciting or interesting, you're welcome to like bring them here. If you want to do a UX session, we could do a UX session here together. We, either Mishti and I could be here to support and to be, kind of like friendly faces to help it go, or we can remove ourselves and we can kind of give you the stage with your colleague or compatriot or, your, and we also have, by the way, we have just now, I was just demoing in Proud, we just now have actually screen sharing available.
Ooh, I was wondering about that. That's exciting.
Yeah, so
yeah. So you can
can you see now?
Oh, snap.
You see now the screen?
That's amazing.
So this is, we have some additional things that we'll polish around this, where we'll make it so that, we can still be here while the screen is being shown, and we'll have a few different kind of stage
That's
layout,
awesome.
kind of video composition things that we're doing. But I think that, if you wanted to do a UX thing, and if we can be helpful, at least know you've got, you've got the stage here if you want it. You've got screen share if you want it. So just let us know.
I will. I feel like I'm probably going to do like closer to my sort of solo sprint for like the first couple revs. And then I suspect that I'm going to have like all these process improvements. And I feel like at that point, this could actually be really helpful. So I have not done any of these full user research interviews. The first ones will hopefully be the end of this week. And so I have suspicions that there will be a lot of room to improve, and this could be really, really helpful. So thank you.
Cool. Yeah, well, whatever format works. We're big fans, so whatever we can do to be helpful.
Thank you. I'm curious, what were you two jamming about before I joined? I think the screen share is awesome. And I'm curious, like, what were you discussing before I hopped in? And thank you for taking this tangent with me.
Yeah, sure. I think we were on Replit.
Yeah, we were on Replit. We were looking at Twitter, and they just announced their like venture incubator fund thing. It's small scale, so it's like $2,000 grants to people who are building on Replit, and it's pretty cool. It's run by this 20-year-old who built something on Replit. But we were just looking at that. Is the link still down below? Yeah. Here it is.
Yeah, there's the announcement link, and then there's the story of Blubber, which was the thing that the guy who's running the program had built on top of Replit, which is like kind of an interesting, I think one of the things that we found interesting about is that it's this, Replit's a company, and they build a software tool, for the web, for kind of software development. But they also, being a company, they're operating as a company, but they're also sort of launching this thing to sort of incubate new things, many of which probably will happen on their platform. And that, you see that same pattern showing up again and again. So you see this, I think the Substack has the creators work. I think Clubhouse has their creators program. There's a bunch of, platforms that are having kind of adjacent, nurture ecosystem of creators, because it's both helps new creation come to the world and helps it come to the world in a way that's consistent with these, the services that these new platforms serve. So there's like a lot of nice, maybe symbiosis that is emerging, and that pattern seems to be kind of happening again and again. At least we have, a handful of examples already top of mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like Figma is another one that comes to mind. I guess they didn't necessarily have like a formal program initially, but it felt like there was a very clear sense of like, how do we connect with like the design community and like these sorts of, this like specific audience of creators and types of creators. And I think some of these programs, it's like the next level of that. How do you really like invest in them and empower them?
Yeah. How does the Figma one work? Is it run through Figma or through some like a Discord or something?
I don't actually know how it's run, but I remember, I think this was like a fireside chat with like Dylan Fields, but I remember hearing about like early on and thinking about their sort of go-to-market. Like there was a really strong focus on, I think, designers who maybe were on like Twitter. I forget where exactly they found it, but it was like a very specific sense of like, these are the types of creators that we sort of want to encourage. And I think they got a lot of feedback early on from that sort of design community. which then like helped them sort of figure out, it seemed like product market fit in like the early days. I think it's a little bit different versus like really like, grants and sort of having more of like, I guess, an established like program or playbook to sort of help create that like early adopter core community like synergy. But I think it's interesting. And I think you're right that it's becoming much more of a thing. And like the Substack one, that jumps out for sure.
And you also, I think another kind of related but maybe somewhat different trend is you see, media companies getting into venture and venture companies, launching media arms.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, is everybody getting a little bit more, multidisciplinary, let's say? Like, it's not enough to build software alone. You need to build software and you need to create the content that helps distribute the software. And then if you have creating content to distribute the software, if there's other people who use the software tools, you want to empower them to themselves grow so that, your customers in a sense are growing and becoming more productive with the tools you're building. You want to see ecosystems of people around you. So yeah, it seems like there's just like this multidisciplinary approach is kind of, in a sense, positively infecting everything.
Yeah, I like it a lot. I mean, it's funny. I wonder if it's like what has led to this? Like, it makes a lot of sense. And I'm like, is it like, we're swinging back from like the build it and they will come. People are like, that's not it at all. Like, you need to like build with or like build alongside, or I don't know. I'm curious what started this trend. It makes a lot of sense. And like, I think the past product marketer in me is like, yes, like this is like how you go to market, how you connect to your audience, like more of this, more of that, like interdisciplinary, like thinking and collaborating. But I'm curious, like, how do you think this came about?
I think some of the stuff from, let's say, like venture and media having some collision probably comes from some combination of like, some people are good at creating media and then they realize that the audiences that gather around them as creators of media are also kind of, one way to monetize their kind of creation process or to sort of, financially sustain that is through a venture capital model instead of through like charging, a subscription fee. So I think there's, natural sets of creators, and I think this happens at every scale. There's like the small Substacks that then become larger Substacks that then kind of become rolling funds or tie venture capital to it. There's the big YouTube creators who realize, wow, we've got this big audience. We can, I don't know, Mr. Beast launched like a hamburger, retail, kind of hamburger chain, 300 hamburger shops all, overnight. And I think separately launched a venture fund recently. So that was kind of like audience first, media first. And then I think there's, examples of like venture capital firms like Andreessen Horowitz that, is kind of their whole lives. They've been really a media company that monetizes through venture capital, but they're sort of created as a venture capital firm rather than like, they look like more like a venture capital firm that just generates tons of media instead of like started as a Substack that then grew up into something else, So I think there's just all kinds of different paths, but the main thing, and I think this is true for companies too, the main thing is, I think companies, venture firms, media companies, operating companies want to be able to share their story and share the stories of customers and share the stories of creators around them. And, sometimes when you go through an existing media arm, it colors the story, it shapes the narrative in a way that, I think is productive for the market to hear, but not always necessarily the way that the company wants to share their own narrative. And so there's just, there's some tension in there. And I think so it becomes natural that people will, correct that tension by sort of, participating in different ways to tell their story, different channels, different distributors, different collaborators, in various ways. I also think we're kind of at the stage where a lot of what's new on the internet is around like, we have so many creative tools and so many new ways to publish and communicate. And so in a sense, if the world is creative tools, what better way to, distribute them than to create with them, right? And I think it's probably different than, if you think like 10-ish years ago when something like, Lyft would have been getting started, the kind of driver rider ecosystem isn't as much of like a creative product as it's like a transactional marketplace. So I think, it's hard to imagine. I mean, you can certainly blog about it. You can tell success stories of people, but it's not as fundamentally a creator driven product. It's more like a transactional marketplace. I think like the world was more like that 10 years ago. And I think it's this kind of new flavor, today, maybe going forward for a while.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I'm trying to think of what are some of the earlier examples, like maybe Twitch streamers or folks that sort of created like this sense of like, almost like a creator as both creating and like the sense of identity of like, you are a creator, where I think like in the Lyft sort of analogy, like, I think you're right that it's like you are a Lyft driver as sort of like a means to an end, but it's not necessarily like a core part of your identity. You're not saying like, I am, me, the Lyft driver. It's more like, yeah, you do this, but it's transactional.
Right. I guess there's also when you're a creator and you own an identity online that's kind of published and available freely, that's like, in a sense, it's let's say it's like it's call it highly volatile. Like you could end up struggling to find an audience, or you could end up having, tens of millions of Twitter followers overnight or TikTok followers or whatever. So, it's highly volatile. There's like, in a sense, much less stability, but there's tremendous amount of upside if it hits. Whereas, if you're a driver for Lyft, you can make a certain wage in a reliable way, but the downside is capped and the upside is capped. So you're a little bit more in a kind of certain type of safety zone, or like lower volatility.
Yeah, it feels more sort of like stable or less risky potentially, depending on how you're thinking about risk, I guess, in that.
Yeah.
Mishti, you look super thoughtful. I'm curious what you're thinking.
Yeah, I'm just swimming in all of these links on the side also. And I was clicking through the Replit Discord too. But then I was looking at some of Mary Meeker's stuff, because she's still producing these like internet trends every year.
Right. It's a springtime phenomenon, isn't it?
I think so. It's funny, like I didn't know when I first came to tech, I didn't know she was a venture capitalist, but I remember like reading her reports because my boss would forward it to me, and it sort of was like, these are like a lot of trends to like think about if you're in consumer, any space really at this point. But I remember from that content, and it sort of became more and more produced, but it was just like the insights were really, really valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, we were kind of talking about yesterday how like building an audience is like the greatest superpower right now, no matter what you want to do. Like once you have an audience, it's kind of like get famous and then do whatever else you want. And I was trying to think, what are like who does this disempower, if anyone, or like what are the ways that people should think about even going about building their first audiences? And we were talking a little bit about definitely like one thing is just the discipline of kind of what you're doing right now, but for content also, like just do different sprints and figure out a couple of places you might have energy and like actually start producing things and starting to get signal about whether it resonates or not. But easier or harder depending on how many nodes you already have to people in certain ecosystems, probably.
I wonder too if there's something of like, I don't know how to, because it's like you can't necessarily control this, but like being an early adopter as well. Like I think if you are a new creator and you happen to land on like a platform that is a good fit for your style of creation early on, I think it's just like so much earlier to build a following. Like, I guess what's coming to mind is like, if you're someone that has like a great like radio DJ late night voice and you are a really Clubhouse user, like you're probably really well positioned to build a following quickly. Whereas like if you're that same person trying to build like a Twitter audience from scratch today, that's probably super challenging, or Instagram for that matter even, or TikTok.
Yeah, and I think different networks have different dynamics, but I think certainly if you can like identify a network relatively early on, and it happens to be a creative format that you're like comfortable and excited about and have some amount of talent in, you can like, practice it while that platform's growing, which becomes then its own growth vector for your success at creating in that format. And I think there's a few examples of this. I want to say, was it, is it Jason Lemkin who did this with Quora? I think he made...
That sounds really familiar.
So I think Jason Lemkin was somewhat famous for having kind of, gotten to Quora early and then, deeply invested in it because he, deeply invested in creating content for it because he knew that he had a little bit of an edge as a creator in that format. I'm actually pulling up a blog right now. So the question is, Jason Lemkin, how important was the exposure on Quora to starting and being so successful with SaaStr? He said it's actually sort of impossible to know. On the one hand, we clearly got more views on Quora than our blog or podcast. And the other hand, what really drives revenue is the SaaStr newsletter. So anyway, I think the net on it is that he says that Quora was impactful part, like the growth of Quora and his early investment of it was impactful for, kind of his career and kind of making SaaStr successful, though certainly not exclusively so. I think there's examples of this. I think about people like, I don't even really know, Shweta who's kind of big on Clubhouse. Do you know that woman who, I think she hosts a lot of stuff. And I don't think
her from Clubhouse. What is she doing now? Or is she doing more audio stuff?
I'm not sure what she's doing at the moment. But I think of her as a name that comes to mind, or like, I might mess this up. Is it Sheil Monat?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so he's... here, I'll pull up a Twitter link, at least for him.
I'm curious, I know it's early, but for Highlighter, have you started to see any sort of rise of new audience builders, or has it been more established folks finding it as a new way to connect with their audience?
Yeah, I mean, we've been a little, I'd say there's some of each, but we've been pretty heads down on trying to get all the platform mechanics to work right. So we haven't invited a lot of third-party creators on yet. We have a long list of people that we keep saying, are we ready? And we're like, well, we've got to fix this set of bugs and we'll go reach back out. So the people that we have welcomed in as creators, I think, we're doing some of these things. I think about the stuff that Josh is doing. I think he was doing some of that in more private scenarios. He was using maybe a private video conference to host kind of a private internal group. And now he has been doing it on Highlighter where he's, same kind of sets of people, but now they're creating this content in public, and then the content lives on, and then other people can engage with it later. And he's been sharing it out.
So cool. Have you seen any of his stuff, Nadia? Here's his Twitter.
I feel like I might have come across some of it, but I haven't followed him, so I probably am missing a ton of it too.
So he works at future.fit for background, which, do you know much about them? They pair you with a personal trainer and do one-on-one personal training. Basically, it's $100 a month. So think of it like a gym membership, but you get the personal tailoring to what you need. And yeah, he's hosted a bunch of really cool sessions, and each of these are just so inspiring. I was just making highlights this morning from one of them, and it's people who are NBA strength coaches has been the first couple so far. And then also future.fit has this giant network of coaches internally. They used to do professional development workshops where they would bring in a speaker and have Q&A and stuff. But I guess also very building in public theme. He hosted one of them last week or 2 weeks ago on Highlighter, and just also it was open for anyone to drop in and RSVP too, and then sharing out the highlights afterwards has been just great speakers, but also nice to see how conversation can continue asynchronously and loop so many more people in after the fact.
That's so cool.
I think Josh is a specific example of somebody who, like, he has perfect talent for this. Like, he has his setup, he's comfortable, on camera and in front of people, and he's comfortable, and he's got a great network of people. So he can bring in really interesting talent. He's got great rapport with them. He makes them feel comfortable. He looks comfortable. So in the resulting video and the resulting highlights that he shares out are just like the very best moments. So he's now got these assets in a sense. I feel like he brought all this raw material to it, and now with the tooling, the way it works, it actually helps him be like a better version of what he was already good at. Now he can actually get it out to the world in a new way. So I think there's like, it's not like he is growing all these talents network around Highlighter. He's sort of bringing them to here, but I think the tool helps him use his talents network in a way that wasn't really hung together in this way before.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So it's kind of cool to think about it for teaching as well. Like, I think there are a couple of themes that I've noticed just like being involved with the highlights and stuff coming up across a couple of his speakers, and like so much is about resilience, and specifically in coaching, like a lot of people talk about how important it is to make the player or kind of client feel like you really understand their psychological needs as well. And I don't know, I can imagine like all of these different topic areas, you could have like so many highlight clips or pieces of chat discussion on them. So it's almost like, I think about Paulina's newsletter where she publishes like how this visionary person, like 5 great lessons from their life or whatever, but you could probably search her corpus and be like, I need some inspiration, or I'm looking for something about like someone fighting imposter syndrome, or someone negotiating something, or someone like rising up from a troubled childhood or whatever. And there could be just like so many video clips for each one. It's a good new way to learn.
Yeah, and when you talk about the learning stuff, I think there's also, there's learning in terms of like the knowledge that you get from all of these discussions. But there's also a different type of learning, which is around, I almost would call it like a better understanding of how these things work. So imagine, if you will, that Nadia ends up building a huge company, and someday there's a team of hundreds or thousands of people around you. And imagine that you have like this video, in fact, this one we're making today, that person who's like, hey, maybe I want to start something someday. They can come back and see how raw and uncertain and poking around it all was. And I think that can be a form of like, could you imagine if you could be sitting there in the garage with Larry and Sergey as they're starting Google right now, and you're like, oh, wow, a couple monitors, a lot of wrong turns, but some things really worked out right. And you're like, how inspiring and exciting would that be? And I think that's the way this is all going, because I think we're all going to be doing more in these public forums. And so I think if team member number 1000 at Nadia Co could see Nadia at day, -90, I think that would be like really inspiring to when that person wants to go out and create something, they feel like they're like, okay, it's possible.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, like that would have been really empowering, I think earlier on, where I feel like I had all these like wrong assumptions about like, oh, it takes like is it the opposite of growth mindset, where it's like it's a certain someone that has to be a founder, have certain things that I don't have. And I feel like I very slowly like unlearned that assumption. And I think part of what helped me was I think, thinking back to like lifting camcorder, it was when I got exposure to folks when they were uncertain or not confident. Yeah. And it wasn't that sort of like, history is told in hindsight after you've succeeded version of things. It was like, okay, what's actually going on? And I think those were both like the most eye-opening, but the most empowering for me to be like, oh, like it's not that there's something, they have something essential that I don't have. It's that they're going for it and taking the risk. And actually, like, I can do that. It's scary, but it's like, it's not a thing that you are born with. It's part of it is just, can you sort of be comfortable going for it in that ambiguity and in that sort of challenge?
Yeah. Kind of circles back to your idea and what you're playing with. Because that is like the biggest, almost game-changing thing for a lot of women probably in their careers. It's like, when is the first time either like someone believed in them, or they read or heard a story that made them have that realization that there was nothing so secret and mystical about people who are succeeding.
Yeah, I definitely think so.
Yeah, like either from the content side, or I don't know how you better like match people with that first person who believes in them. That's a really critical thing, but yeah.
And it seems like the idea of curated networks can be, at least one part of that solution. Like to find people who, would be good connections for people. I think if you can take some of your kind of layer of taste in content and or people and help make new connections that could be productive, it does feel like that's, in a sense, we're in this world of like plenty, every human is on the internet and every piece of content has been sort of rewritten, 1,000 different ways. But then like, which are the ones that we should be spending our time looking at and thinking about or connecting with? And I think that's a hard problem that's pretty unsolved.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah. I wonder, I don't know, like there's cold and warm outreach is probably still the best way of doing this, but people have like super peer, but I'm wondering like what the reverse super peer is, like for people who want to help and are industry leaders or want to be mentors. Like a lot of people want to be mentors, I think, when they reach a certain point in their careers and want to give back. But maybe it's hard for them, especially as organizations are increasingly remote, and if they want to not necessarily be restricted to their own company or people they know. Like, could I find in like 15 years or whenever I thought I had useful things to say, like a list of people with like profiles of young women or insert X like category of person, and what they were working on and like what problems they had, and almost like a marketplace, but except the person in the position of power is exposed to a lot of people who they could really help if they have the desire to.
Yeah.
And it works both ways too, actually.
I think it does. And I think like that marketplace dynamic is interesting because I think at any given point, like there are people, a step or two above you and a step or two behind you. And I think it's like, it's interesting, like in some of my earlier brainstorms for this week, like one of the things that came up was it's both like being able to sort of find, people that are helpful that you can learn from, but also like how to connect. Like there are things like, for folks who are a little further along in that sort of mid-career range, like, how do I join a board? How do I scale my time effectively? Like at least anecdotally, like for me, it's a lot of like one-on-ones, mentoring or ad hoc, like helping organizations as they reach out. But that like fundamentally doesn't scale. And so I think there's something interesting there too around how do you help people understand, like, how do you turn it from sort of this like casual, like side, like labor that's done out of caring to something that like actually is like more marketplacey and that it's like helpful, but not necessarily transactional, which I think is where it's tricky.
Yeah, that's true. It's a good point that it works both ways. Like, yeah, not making it transactional is tricky. I mean, you could imagine something that's like limited to some ecosystem where like if you have a call or help someone, it could be a college student, or if you're like early career, whatever, a peer or someone thinking about something that you have something to weigh in on about, you get like points in the system, or I don't know how you would make it such that it, like, yeah, how do you design the dynamics such that like people are all helping each other instead of just like a down, up to down kind of thing? Yeah.
Are there people, kind of, Nadi, you've been in this program now with South Park Commons and the Fellows. Are there people from the program that you've sort of found kind of kindred spirits or kind of excitement around these ideas, or how do you take an idea like this through that process?
In terms of like interacting with sort of the other founders in the program, or how so?
Yeah, like would you frame this and take somebody along for some UX feedback that you may have in mind if you're sort of going through these design sprints? Is that kind of an appropriate way to work with the network, or do you sort of find the people that you want to collaborate with on kind of the design sprints outside?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so far I've been more focused on like doing it sort of solo and just starting it out like myself. I think there's like a bit of an open question for me on like, if I decide that it's not working solo and I want to sort of bring in people, what's the right approach? I think folks would be super open. Like I had asked, I think last week in my workshop session, would you be open to contributing to a sprint if I, in a few weeks, asked you to? And I think generally people were pretty excited to help, which I think is great. But I'm not sure. And it's interesting. There's like a chicken and egg question that I think I'm pushing myself to lean into, like, first being excited about the problem space, like ideating. And I think part of it is just like that feels to me like just instinctively the right place to spend my time. But I think there's a question for me of like, I do tend to be very collaborative. In working with others, like I would say I'm very capable of working alone, but I really enjoy working with others. I like deliberately have not prioritized at this stage, like looking for a co-founder. I'm open to it, but it's not something that I feel like is urgent. And I think there's a good question for me of like, is that something that as time progresses, I'm going to want to spend more time on or more meaningfully prioritize versus just being open to it. And I think it's a big question for me of like, what's the best way to work? Is it first being solo? Is it having a team? Is it looking for someone to really partner with? And I think part of me is like, I'm so new to all of this. I want to just focus on like, we'll do it solo. It's like, we're not at a point where that's a blocker at all. Like maybe certain things are slower, but I think as I progress, I'm going to be really curious. And I don't know that I have the answer. I think it could go either way. And I think it would be really important to find the right person, which I think probably is hard. So yeah, I don't know. I would say it's interesting if the other founder fellows, like I don't think there have been any new co-founder relationships that have started. There should have been solo founders and there are groups. And I think there's more been like shift of like for groups, people considering maybe being solo founders, but there hasn't yet been like recoupling. Although I think some people have found co-founders, in parallel, sort of not from the fellow group.
Mm-hmm. Is that through relationships through the fellow group?
I think a lot of it is through personal networks, although there is sort of the wider like South Park Commons community. And I do think people find co-founders sort of in that if you're interested in similar domains. Mm-hmm. And I think they're very active on the donuts, which I have mixed feelings about the donuts, but like there's a very active like donut intro sort of contingent.
Right. What is the general like South Park Common? There's sort of the general program, and then there's the Founder Fellows program.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there a lot of interplay, or there's a few key moments when those overlap, or how does that work?
Interesting. I think it really is like up to the individual. Like I think for me, I've tried to be really deliberate about exploring the wider community because I think it could be valuable. And I think other folks have been more sort of involved in just the fellowship or, this plus other external communities. And I think for me, like, it was a little bit of like trial and error where the first few weeks, I think it was like almost like a buffet where I was like, I want to try all the different things, all these forums and programs and chats. And it was very clear quickly that like some of them were good and some of them were good, but not necessarily for me at the stage I'm at. And so I've tried to do a mix where I'm part of some parts of sort of the wider community, and I found some resources there that I think are helpful, some of the recurring events that I like to prioritize going to, and then there's sort of the more specific like fellowship programming with just the founder fellows that you also have sort of layered on top of it. I think if folks feel like they are further along or maybe like have very strong sensibility of like what they want, like it might be less useful. But I think it's interesting because you get a little bit of a different sampling with the wider community. You have sort of different personality types. And and folks working on different things that I've found it's been nice to sort of get that perspective too.
Yeah, that sounds like a really special group.
It's really cool.
Yeah. We were saying that it'll be interesting to see like 5-10 fellowship cohorts from now how processes and things have evolved, because it's like there's so much uncertainty that everyone probably has, and like what kind of processes or like matching between people and all of that as facilitators, how should they be thinking and how will they evolve their thinking around what's most useful for people when they're sort of at ideation stage.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because it's like there's this interesting tension, I think, where it's like it's really hard to be prescriptive on like what to do at this earliest stage. Like I think everyone has really different approaches, and part of it is like structured, unstructured. It's like how do you support that but also give space and not become overly prescriptive? And so I don't know, I think it's something that they've actually, like, while we've sort of been in the program, like sort of live reacted to feedback, but I'm curious like how it will evolve as well. And I think like for me going forward, like what are the parts that I sort of will keep applying, what will change? I'm going to be very curious to sort of see it evolve as I hopefully move forward in this process and go closer to an idea versus where I am now.
Yeah. What's some of the I was going to ask like what's some of the live feedback been, or like for yourself personally, if you think I wish I had more of this in my own thinking process, that'd be really useful. Like one thing we talked about is the more focused sprints with kind of thought peers idea. But like what else is useful for decision making and like ideation, you think?
I mean, I think it's interesting as time has gone on, sort of seeing how different folks advance in their own processes, where I think for folks who have sort of started earlier versus me, where I like literally cold started like a couple months ago, I think it's interesting because you sort of see like a bit of a divergence where folks basically will find an idea and either sort of validate it and like invest further in it. And now we're sort of moving towards, potentially building teams, investing more, getting their seed round going, or they have sort of validated that this idea is like there's not a there that they are bullish on, or they don't want to work on it, or something else, and then are sort of circling back with I think a greater degree of like learning. And for that, I think it's harder, but it's also still a success in that like they go through that process I think a lot faster than they would have like sort of just on their own. And I think for me, that's really helpful because it feels a little bit like, all right, I'm like looking, 3 months, 6 months ahead at like, these are different possible outcomes. And this is how folks are handling them and how they're sort of learning from them. And so I think for me, that's been, sorry, I'm like not answering your question. I'm like rambling, but I think that's been really, really helpful to sort of get a sense of like, okay, like, these are some outcomes that could happen. And like, this is how I could apply that if I get to that point. But also being a little bit earlier, it feels like, although you could argue it's not because I just have gone through the loop fewer times, like, I think there's something too about just like, for me individually, like figuring out like, how do I sort of make the most of this, given that I am sort of cold starting relative to everyone else. And I think that's something that I've been thinking a lot about, is just like, how can I be efficient, knowing that, it might not be possible. Like it might just take time. It might take not, being super on all the time, like sort of grind yourself to a brilliant idea, I think. So how do you approach it?
Well, I was going to say, like, have you been getting some just like mental blank space time?
Yeah, I've been trying
to.
It's interesting because it's like, it's funny. Like, I think this is like my German side coming out, but I'm like so efficiency driven. And I think there's part of me that like wants to just like grind. And I think, I'm like, this is like my own time. Like I want to make the most of it. But I actually think that that's not the right way to get to a good outcome. So I've been trying to be really deliberate about carving out off time. And like on the weekends, I try to be mostly offline, mostly not working. I try not to check my phone or computer too much and just be unplugged. And then during the weeks, I've been trying to be a little bit more deliberate in like the mornings and evenings about not just like waking up and sort of, flopping over to my laptop and have a little bit of like almost like ritual, but also things that are hopefully going to help fill me up and nourish me, so that when I am ideating, maybe it's less hours, but those hours are actually more productive. We'll see, because we don't know what the outcome will be, but I suspect that this will be hopefully a much more sustainable approach versus my instinct of like, just grind.
Right. Are there certain activities so there's certainly like, there's your heads down grind, and then there's your like disconnect and live your life. And are there activities that you may categorize as like work, but focused in a divergent style as opposed to a convergent style? So when I think about grind, I think about trying to like whittle things down and focus and narrow. And I think there's a certain type of like work that is more divergent in nature, where you're open to possibilities, but you might not be like totally relaxing or surfing or something. You could be doing some like work, but what does that feel like to you? Or how do you sort of think about those trade-offs?
The biggest ones there that I've tried to sort of keep space for in the divergent side is just reading, and like reading books that are like related. So I have like probably 4 or 5 different books that folks have recommended on sort of like the depression, sadness, like digital age. And I think those are like not directly related to sort of like the work of work right now, but I think hopefully give like, it's like subject matter related divergent space. And the other thing I've tried to do, although I think this is probably less successful versus reading, is sign up for like webinars or other events or things that I notice that are sort of tangentially related that like may or may not be helpful. I think those sometimes, especially when they feel like not helpful, feel like more like time wastery things. But that's how I've tried to maintain, because I think it is helpful. And I think I probably need to work a little bit on like the structuring here, because I think it's too scattered right now. But I think it is helpful to have some of those like exploratory nudges, because I think it will introduce things that I probably wouldn't have thought of in that sort of heads down, like focused, narrow gaze. But it will help inform it as I sort of keep turning that flywheel.
Right. Are there any kind of new products or services maybe that you aren't actively thinking about building, but that have inspired you in one way or another?
Oof, that's a good question.
Like I think we're both on this new Friends app that Greg built. Yeah. Have you been getting into it or using it a bit? Or
I like it a lot. Like Lexi added me, and I think it's been cool. Like a few of his and my like surf friends are on it, and so I think it's been a lot of like surf content and things that just like are really joyful. And I think that's actually probably a good example of divergent thinking, because it's like I think it's taking a really different approach to some of the problems that I'm interested in, where it's like, how do you take this thing like social media and make it more of a like delightful, fulfilling experience versus something that sort of is, draining or leaning into more negative tendencies. So I think that's something where like I would probably never have built it, but I'm enjoying it a lot. And I think probably there are more things that I should do, that I should play with, because I feel like there's not a ton that come to mind, actually.
Yeah, I find that personally, the process of like trying new products and then kind of like trying to analyze how does it kind of how does it sit with me? Like, am I enthusiastic? Am I like constantly thinking about it? Am I bored? Do I wish it were different? Like, I think that process is, in a sense, it's kind of it's a work-related thing, but it's also kind of a fun and divergent related thing. Like I can use, when I use Friends, I'm not thinking, oh, good, I'm using Friends so I can make Highlighter better. Right. Though I think I'm trying to think like, well, on Friends, why do we structure relationships this way? And how does publishing work this way? And how is this graph and this consumption experience shaped to serve this problem, and what problem is it solving, and how should it feel, and am I getting the feeling so in a sense it kind of, it's a little bit of like I'd call it almost like in that category of divergent but work focused things. It's not like every time I take a picture or share something on Friends that I'm sort of making Highlighter better, but I think I'm like, in a sense, trying to shape my taste in products when I use something like that. So I wonder if there's, I think that as a pattern, I'd say, I've enjoyed and I think helps with some of that divergence. I wonder if there's, a structured process to gather the things that you might find inspiring. Like I'm thinking of other things that we've played with, like as a team internally at Highlighter, we played with like the stuff that Florent is working on is now called Team Flow. And I think when we use that, we can form an opinion about like, how does this make us feel when we work together this way? Is this fun? Is it annoying? Do we wish it did something else? I think we were all playing with Pluto a while back. Yeah. I think that also feels a lot of like, okay, is the 3D helpful? Does it get in the way? Does it help in certain places? So.
Yeah, fun and useful to like more explicitly be the consumer of something and then see what questions you end up asking. Mm-hmm. And those will probably resurface like in your building life, I'm sure.
Yeah, are there other products in the kind of like, broad sense of things that have shown up, either friends are building or somebody was using a cool little tool that sort of intrigues you?
It's a good question. Like, I think this has been sort of a very divergent, but I think like one thing that was sort of inspiring this week was I did like basically like a lightning demo session where you just look at lots of different things for a couple minutes each to try to it's sort of exactly like try to like get inspired in sort of like a quirky but still divergent way. I think one of the ones that was more random that I was inspired by was I took an Enneagram test as part of this like random workshop that I went to. And the way that the test was structured, that like binary, like, do you identify with this or this? I had that sort of feeling of like that, like you're taking the test, but then you're also like reflecting on the structure of the test. You're like, oh, this is interesting. I have been trying to join a lot of the like sort of communities that I think could solve for some of the things that I'm interested in, but I haven't. I mean, it's what we were talking about earlier, where I feel like a lot of them I haven't heard of folks that have like engaged meaningfully, and like myself have had some issues engaging meaningfully with it, where it's like a lot of Substacks now where I'm like, ooh, like, I don't know. It's almost, it loses a little bit, I think, of that like fun and playfulness and is more like, okay, this feels now like, is this good work or is it just work? I don't know. But yeah, I'm trying to think. I feel like hopefully as I start prototyping, there will be more. Like I think probably when I hop off, I'm going to get to dive into prototype with Figma a little bit, which I've used before at Lyft, but I haven't really I haven't been the one doing the whole prototype myself. So I think that actually could be really interesting.
Right. And are you going to just go in on your own, or are you going to go to like, I know there's some people who stream on Twitch or on YouTube that might actually do little kind of tutorials. Would you look to something like that as a resource, or would you kind of go in?
I think it's probably a bit of both. Like, I think I'm going to play a little bit on my own. I was Googling earlier, and there's a lot of like templates as well, which I think could be really helpful, just particularly for, if you're doing like mobile or web, like folks have different frameworks. There's a lot of sort of tutorial primers. So I think it's going to be a bit of both in terms of just like exploring and sort of seeing both like, how do I prototype this thing, but also how do I learn about this tool and like sort of have fun while doing it, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Good. Well, I think we are always here, and we always want to be helpful as you're thinking through stuff. So don't ever hesitate if you have a rough idea or something that you want to run by us. Stop by, and we'd love to
build it in public.
Love to build it in public with you. Yeah.
Same, and thank you.
While eating lunch, which is still allowed.
You're still welcome to eat lunch.
Thank you. This is awesome. Thank you for letting me join, and I hope you have a great afternoon. I'll keep you guys posted. I'm sure I'll be back soon, and I'll be like, these parts were awesome. This part was a disaster.
Yeah, I'm so curious after this week what you learn. I definitely want to hear about it.
I'll be back soon for sure.
Cool.
Great. Okay.
Good to see you. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Yep. Have a good one.